The Soulforged by Margaret Weis. Book 1. A mage's soul is forged in the crucible of the magic. Antipodes of the White Robes. Chapter 1. He never wore his white robes while traveling. Few mages did in those days, the days before the great and terrible war of the land spilled out of its cauldron like boiling oil and scalded the countryside. In those days, just 15 or so years before the war, the fire beneath the pot had been lit. The Dark Queen and her minions had struck the sparks that would start the blaze. The oil was cool, black, and sluggish in the cauldron, but at the bottom the oil was beginning to simmer. Most people on Ansalon would never see the cauldron, much less the bubbling oil inside, until it was poured on their heads, along with dragon fire and the countless horrors of war. At this time of relative peace, the majority of people living on Ansalon never looked up, never looked from side to side to see what was going on in the world around them. Instead, they gazed at their own feet, plodding through the dusty day, and if they ever lifted their heads, it was usually to see if it was likely to rain and spoil their picnic. A few felt the heat of the newly kindled fire. A few had been watching closely the turgid black liquid in the cauldron. Now they could see that it was starting to simmer. These few were uneasy. These few began to make plans. The wizard's name was Antipodes. He was human, of good middle-class merchant stock, hailing from Port Balfour. The youngest of three, he had been raised in the family business, which was tailoring. To this day he still displayed with pride the scars of the pinpricks on the middle finger of his right hand. His early experience left him with a canny business sense and a taste for and knowledge of fine clothing. One reason he rarely wore his white robes. Some mages were afraid to wear their robes, which were a symbol of their calling, because that calling was not well loved in Ansalon. Antipodes was not afraid. He did not wear his white robes because white showed the dirt. He detested arriving at his destination mud splattered, the stains of the road upon him. He traveled alone, which in those uneasy days meant that he was either a fool, a kender, or an extremely powerful person. Antipodes was not a fool, nor was he a kender. He traveled alone because he preferred his own company and that of his donkey Jenny to that of almost all others of his acquaintance. Hired bodyguards were generally loutish and dull, not to mention expensive. Antipodes could adequately and handedly defend himself should need arise. Antipodes was journeying to the Tower of High Sorcery in Weyrith. He was taking the long way around, for he could have easily walked the corridors of magic in order to reach the tower from his home in Port Balfour. He had requested to make the journey overland. The request had come from Pa Salian, head of the Order of the White Robes and head of the Wizards' Conclave, and therefore, strictly speaking, Antipodes' master. The two were fast friends, However, their friendship, dating back to the day when both were young and had arrived at the tower at the same time to take the exacting, grueling, and occasionally lethal test. Both had been kept waiting in the same antechamber in the tower. Each had shared his trepidation and fear with the other. Each had found much needed comfort, consolation, and support. The two white robes had been friends ever since. Thus Parsalian requested that Antimodes take this long and tiresome journey. The head of the conclave did not order it as he might have done with another. Antimodes was to accomplish two goals during his journey. First, he was to peer into every dark corner, eavesdrop on every whispered conversation, peep through the shutters of every whispered window that was locked and bolted. Second, he was to look for new talent. The first was a bit dangerous. People do not take kindly to snoops, especially if said people have something to hide. The second was tedious and boring, for it generally meant dealing with children, and Antimodes had an aversion to children. All in all, Antimodes preferred the spying. He had written his report in his neat and precise tailor's handwriting in a journal, which he would turn over to Parsalian. Antimodes reread in his mind every word in that journal as he trotted along on his white donkey, a present from his eldest brother, who had taken over the family business and was now a prosperous tailor in Port Balfour. Antimodes spent his time on the road pondering all he had seen and heard. Nothing significant, everything portentous.
Parsalian will find this interesting reading,
Antimodes told Jenny, who gave her head a shake and pricked her ears to indicate her agreement.
I look forward to handing the journal over.
Her master continued.
He will read it and ask questions, and I will explain what I have seen and heard, all the while drinking his most excellent elven wine. And you, my dear, will have oats for dinner.
Jenny gave her hearty approval. In some places in which they'd stayed, she'd been forced to eat damp, moldy hay, or worse. Once she'd actually been offered potato peelings. The two had nearly reached their journey's end. Within the month, Antimodes would arrive at the Tower of High Sorcery in Weyrith. Or, rather, the tower would arrive at Antimodes. One never found the magical Tower of Weyrith. It found you, or not, as its master chose. This night Antimodes would spend in the town of Solace. He would have pushed on, for the season was late spring and it was only noon, with plenty of daylight left for travel. But he was fond of Solace, fond of its famous inn, the Inn of the Last Home, fond of Otic Sandath, the inn's owner, and especially fond of the inn's ale. Antimodes had been tasting that chilled dark ale with its creamy head in his imagination ever since he had swallowed his first mouthful of road dust. His arrival in Solace went unnoticed, unlike his arrival in other towns in Ansalon, where every stranger was taken to be a thief or plague carrier, a murderer or kidnapper of children. Solace was a different town than most on Ansalon. It was a town of refugees who had fled for their lives during the cataclysm and had only stopped running when they came to this location. Having once been strangers on the road themselves, the founders of Solace took a kindly view toward other strangers, and this attitude had been passed down to their descendants. Solace had become known as a haven for outcasts, loners, the restless, the adventuresome. The inhabitants were friendly and tolerant, up to a point. Lawlessness was known to be bad for business, and Solace was a town with a sharp eye for business. Being located on a bustling road that was the major route from northern Ansalon to all points south, Solace was accustomed to entertaining travelers, but that was not the reason few noticed the arrival of Antimodes. The main reason was that most of the people of Solace never saw him, due to the fact that they were high above him. The major portion of the town of Solace was built in the vast, spreading, gigantic branches of the immense and wondrous Valenwood trees. The early inhabitants of Solace had literally taken to the trees to escape their enemies, having found living among the treetops to be safe and secure. They had built their homes among the leaves, and their descendants and those who came after them had continued the tradition. Craning his neck, Antimodes looked up from the donkey's back to the wooden plank bridges that extended from tree to tree, watching the bridges swing and sway as the villagers hastened across on various errands. Antimodes was a dapper man, with an eye for the ladies, and though the women of Solace kept their flowing skirts firmly in hand when crossing the bridges, there was always the possibility of catching a glimpse of a shapely ankle or a well-turned leg. Antimode's attention to this pleasant occupation was interrupted when he heard sounds of shrill yelling. He lowered his gaze to find that he and Jenny had been overtaken by a brigade of bare-legged, sunburned boys with wooden swords and tree-branch spears, and giving battle to an army of imaginary foes. The boys had not meant to run down Antimodes. The swirl of battle had carried them in his direction. The invisible goblins or ogres or whatever enemies the boys chased were in full retreat toward Christamere Lake. Caught up in the shouting, yelling, sword-thwacking melee, Antimode's donkey Jenny shied and danced, wild-eyed with fright. By the twitch of her long ears and the baring of her yellow teeth, Jenny was obviously prepared to strike back by bucking and kicking at the boys, which would have probably not damaged the boys much, but would certainly dislodge her rider. Antimodes endeavored to control the donkey, but he was not having any luck. The younger boys, maddened with battle lust, did not see the man's distress. They swirled about him, lashing out with their swords, shrieking and crowing in shrill triumph. Antimodes might well have entered Solace on his posterior, when, out of the dust and noise, an older boy, perhaps about 8 or 9, appeared, caught hold of Jenny's reins, and with a gentle touch and forceful presence calmed the terrified donkey. "Go around," the youth ordered, waving his sword, which he had shifted to his left hand. "Clear out, fellows! You're frightening the donkey." The younger boys, ranging in age from 6 upward, good-naturedly obeyed the youth and continued on the rowdy way. Their shouts and laughter echoed among the enormous trunks of the Valenwood trees. The older boy paused, and, with an accent that was definitely not this part of Ansalon, spoke his apology as he soothingly stroked the donkey's soft nose.
Forgive us, good sir. We were caught up in our play and did not notice your arrival. I trust you have taken no harm.
The young man had straight, thick blonde hair, which he wore bowl-cropped around his ears in a style that was popular in Solamnia, but nowhere else on Krynn. His eyes were grey-blue, and he had a stern and serious demeanor that belied his years, a noble bearing of which he was extremely conscious. His speech was polished and educated. This was no country bumpkin, no laborer's son.
Thank you, young sir,
Antimodes replied. He carefully took stock of his spell components, checking to make sure that the buffeting he had taken had not loosened any of his pouches he wore on his belt. He was about to ask the young man's name, for he found himself interested in this youth, but on looking up, he found the young man's blue eyes fixed upon the pouches. The expression on the youthful face was one of disdain, disapproval.
If you are certain you are well, Sir Mage, and have taken no harm from our prey, I will take my leave.
The youth made a stiff and rigid bow, and letting loose the donkey's halter, turned to run after the other boys.
Coming, Kit?
He called briskly to another older boy who had halted to study the stranger with interest.
In a minute, Sturm,
said the other youth, and it was only when she spoke that Antimodes realized this curly-haired boy, wearing pants and a leather vest, was actually a girl. She was an attractive girl, now that he studied her closely, or perhaps he should say young lady, for though only in her early teens, her figure was well defined. Her movements were graceful, and her gaze was bold and unwavering. She studied Antimodes in her turn, regarding him with an intense, thoughtful interest that he found difficult to understand. He was accustomed to meeting with disdain and dislike, but the young woman's interest was not idle curiosity. Her gaze held no antipathy. It seemed as if she were making up her mind about something. Antimodes was old-fashioned in his attitude toward women. He liked them soft and perfumed, loving and gentle, with blushing cheeks and properly downcast eyes. He realized that in this day of powerful female wizards and strong female warriors, his attitude was backward, but he was comfortable with it. He frowned slightly to indicate his own disapproval of this young hoyden, and clucked at Jenny, urging her in the direction of the public stables, located near the blacksmith's shop. The stables, the blacksmith's, and the baker's shop, with its immense ovens, were three of the few buildings in Solace situated on the ground. Even as Antimodes passed by the young woman, he could feel her brown-eyed gaze focused on him, wondering, considering.